Welcome back to another episode of the Pursuit of Progress podcast. You guys, I felt like it's been a cold winter. It's been several months since my partner in crime has been able to be back with us. So, more than anything, super excited to have my co host, Ben Adams, back on the podcast. He's back in town. What's up, man?
Hey, how you doing? And you're right, it has been too long, and I can't believe it's been as long as it is, but really excited to be back here in the podcast and give everyone an update of what I've been up to and, share that with you and the rest of the audience.
And I just thinking through what I just said, I said it's been a cold winter. I guess that was probably the worst possible thing to say, considering that I'm in Colorado right now and it's pushing 100 degrees, and Ben is at one of his vacation rentals down in Tucson where they were hitting 112 yesterday or a few days ago. So maybe I need to think my words through a little bit more carefully next time. But regardless,
I was
it's
thinking
been
it was
hot.
an analogy. I was thinking you were, speaking metaphorically there instead of literally.
Well, it has been a cold, dark winter without you by my side on the podcast. So excited to have you back, buddy.
Well, excited to be back, so thank you for the warm.
So let's start with just getting a little bit of an update, man. I want to hear about your trip, just what you've been up to. It's been over a month, I think, since we've had you on the show. So give our audience just a little bit of an update on what you and your family have been up to.
Yeah, right now I'm down here in Tucson, Arizona. As you mentioned, we are in, and what I love about Tucson is that it really is one of the most unique places in the world. I've always said that the Sonoran Desert down here, it'll get up to 115, 120 degrees in the summer, but it's still crawling and thriving with ant life, plant life, animal life. You have the saguaro cactus down here. Since we've been down here the 5 nights. I've seen roadrunners, coyotes, lizards, all different types of birds, quail running around. And so I really do love coming down here this time of year. Prior to that, though, I was in Europe for 25 days with myself, my girlfriend, the kids, and then also my aunt from California met us out there. And none of us have ever gone on a trip that long. We visited 4 different countries over 25 days. And this was a fun stat that we had. We had a total of 8 flights over that 25-day period, just between
Wow.
all the different places that we were going.
So what were the four countries? I know one of those is kind of an outlier, I think. I think, correct? One of those Canada, and then the other three are in Europe.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We spent one night in Canada on the way back. So that was in Calgary. We were only there for a night, but we started off in Paris. We spent 8 nights in Paris, France, then went to Rome, Italy. We were there for 5 nights, and from there moved on to Berlin. Spent 6 nights in Berlin, and then went back to France, back to Paris. Spent 4 more nights in Paris, and then one night in Calgary, and then came home back to the USA after 25 nights.
Sounds like a hell of a trip, man. So give us a few favorite moments. First thing I always think of, especially talking about Italy and France, is just the food. So I'm sure you guys had some incredible food that I think of, those places as kind of the stereotypical, like in Italy, pizza, pasta, but I'm sure maybe they have some other things that were unique or just things that really stood out as just being incredible.
Yeah, the food scene really in all of Europe is so different than what we have in the United States. Paris in particular, it was so fun just walking around, and it's so easy to get around in a lot of these European countries as far as the transportation. There's trams, buses, subways. They're also very big on biking. France and Berlin in particular had excellent biking systems. And then you also have a lot of people that just being new to Europe and not having been there for 20 years, I really enjoyed walking as much as we could. And it's funny because if you look at my health stats and how many steps I took, I mean, I was averaging, 30,000 steps a day just with all of the walking that we were doing. And so
Well,
not everyone wanted to do that. So, my kids sometimes would take a taxi or take the subway, and I did too. But what's nice is that you have all of these options right at your fingertips, really in every part of the city. And it's very accessible. And the food in Europe, that was one of my big takeaways, is that it's so much healthier as far as the nutritional value. Everything is so much more wholesome, and you can really, really taste how much healthier the food is. In the United States, everything we have is just so processed and ultra. And out there, just the breads and the pasta and the pizza, and just you can really taste how wholesome everything is. And that was something that we really, really enjoyed. Just it was so fun to get to experience that. And we did do, appetizers, we did our main courses, and then a lot of times we did have desserts. One thing that was really funny is that in Europe, if you sit down and have a Coke, your Coke a lot of times is anywhere from 9 to 11 euros. So one bottle of Coke, 12 ounces, is like 9 to 11 euros, and it's more expensive than like the actual appetizer. And
And
so
sorry to interrupt you, but give us a for euros to dollars, just the conversion. Isn't that like 18 or 20 bucks US? Like what is the conversion?
it's not quite like 10 euros right now is about $12.
Oh,
And
okay.
so yeah, so it has been at different places over the last couple of years, but we're in one of the more favorable currency translations in 2024 here. But yeah, like you sit down and you pay, $13 or $12 American dollars for a Coke, and then you multiply that by four. Well, all of a sudden you're at like 50 US dollars, and you're just, everyone's had one drink.
That's why they drink so much wine over there, huh? Wine's like $2 and Coke's 12.
Yeah, but I mean, like some of the adult beverages are actually less. Our first night in Berlin, we went to an authentic German restaurant, and when you walk in, they don't serve you tap water or house water. They actually literally serve you beer as you're like, sit down, here's a beer. And the kids are like, hey, I want a beer. Where's my beer? I was like, not yet.
Yeah, my a couple other friends were just in Italy a couple months ago, and they were talking about these like little like holes in these different like you could walk down like an alley, and there's these. It's almost like it's not even a restaurant. It's just I think it's somebody's home, but they'll serve you like fresh wine, where it's just like a hole in the side of the wall, and you just like stick your money through it, and then somebody basically just see a hand that comes through the opening and just gives you your wine. So a little different over there.
Yeah, we didn't experience anything quite like that, but when we were in Rome, off of the main streets and a lot of these smaller streets where the alleys are, they did have a lot of really just small places like that, very intimate, gelato stops, restaurants, and so just the culture piece, just so much more kind of intimate out there, really, really with everything. How people live, how they dress. That was another big one. Europeans are much better dressed, just in average. I can't tell you how many men in suits I saw in Paris. Just walking down the street in a suit. The women a lot of times are very, very dressed up. And another thing that I really notice is that when you look at like U.S. obesity rates, how that really is kind of a crisis here in the US. Like you do not see that in Europe at all. Your average European is much healthier. There's not nearly as many that are overweight, and so that was one big thing. They do drink. It felt like more alcohol. That's part of their culture with the wine, and then also smoking over there is very, very popular. So a lot more biking, a lot more walking, but then they do smoke more, they do drink more, and so it's kind of a little bit of a give and take. I don't think they work out as much over there. That scene was very different. Not nearly the amount of gyms and the places to work out. There were a couple, but nothing like the United States.
Hmm. It is interesting how they have certain aspects where they're healthier, and then others where they haven't really caught up to the U.S. on, especially with the smoking. That's
I know.
crazy to me.
That was a surprise to me, just because here in 2024 we know how bad smoking is for you, but out there it's like everyone smokes. I mean, just smoking all over the place.
Indoors also, or just
It felt like a lot of the restaurants there are kind of like half indoor, half outdoor, and so a lot of times like it'll kind of just transition into outdoor on the patio or even go onto the street. So it felt like most of that was happening outside. I don't actually know
and
if
then
they
that
allow it inside, but it felt like most of it was out on the patio.
And then one last thing, just on this topic, Vaughn, I remember you telling me a few days ago, maybe you can share with our audience too, though, about just how kind of dirty some of these areas were. I think specifically you were talking about Rome being just a little bit of a disappointment when it came to just kind of dumping its
Mhm.
trash and that kind of stuff. Or like what exactly it was.
Yeah, that was one of the big takeaways. Paris, for example, is one of the bigger cities in Europe. It has around 14 or 15 million, and I think it is actually the biggest city in Europe. And Paris did, for the most part, a pretty good job of, keeping things clean. Rome, though, was very, very shocking. And that was kind of one of my takeaways from Rome, where it was so fun getting to see and visit some of those historical sites, the Colosseum, and all of these different places that are 1,000, 2,000 years old. But then walking down the streets of Rome, kind of just spray paint and graffiti everywhere. The trash in Rome, like what you do in trash is you literally just take your trash and you throw it on the street in a trash bag, and then you wait for the trash man to come pick it up. So as you're walking down the sidewalks, in the afternoon, you're navigating around like just piles of trash, literally. And so it smells, and it just kind of, the vibe is a little bit different, but that's just how they do it down there. The driving in Rome was extremely, extremely aggressive. Rome, like Berlin and Paris, is very pedestrian heavy, so a lot of people walk, but some of these cars are going so fast, just like walking across the street, and they're coming at you like 50 miles an hour, and you're in a crosswalk, and they just slam their brakes on like right before they get to you. So it was a little traumatizing at times, just walking around with the traffic.
And then did you see a lot of stuff going on with the Olympics coming up in France and Paris? Did you see a lot of preparation? I mean, you're just there just a couple weeks before that's all getting kicked off. I
Yeah,
think it's next week.
yeah. It's a week from this Friday is when the opening ceremonies are. So yeah, that was a lot of fun. Not only did we see the Eiffel Tower, but we were there when they were putting the Olympic rings on the Eiffel Tower, and they were building out all these different venues. The entire city of Paris is hosting the Olympics, and so right at the Eiffel Tower, they were building two stadiums. And I read yesterday morning that that's where the beach volleyball is going to be.
Sounds
One of
cool.
the plazas where like Mary Antoinette, for example, was executed, that is an Olympic venue. And so I don't know what event is going to be there, but there is a venue there as well. And I can't imagine, because the subways were jam packed. Just before, and this is 6 weeks before the Olympics, and so that was one of our conversation topics, because the Olympics is literally going to bring in millions of additional tourists and spectators. And so I'm just thinking, like, how is the city going to accommodate all of this? Because it's already like jam packed in so many different areas. So it was fun being out there before the Olympics, kind of getting to experience that a little bit. But then at the same time, like, if you're going to be there during the Olympics, it is going to be very, very hectic.
Yeah, that doesn't really interest me too much as far as being there during the Olympics, but it's cool you guys got to see that beforehand.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool.
So I'd love to just dive a little bit deeper into a few other observations you had. It's kind of our main topic of the episode today is just kind of comparing some of the differences between Europe and America when it comes to real estate, mortgages, buying and selling homes, and just the overall work ethic and just
Mhm.
the mindset that Europeans have when compared to Americans when it comes to not only work, but I think physical activity, like we were talking earlier, just family life, just a little bit of everything. So I thought it was really interesting. We were talking offline before this episode began, just learning a little bit about some of these, again, observations that you had when it came to real estate. So share a little bit about that with us.
Yeah, me, I'm always keeping an eye out for housing and real estate. It's a professional passion of mine. It's also a personal passion. Our first night in Paris, we went to an eat with dinner where we were hosted by a local Parisian. And what was so fun about that is that there were 4 or 5 other families that were in town visiting. And I was visiting with an individual who spends half his time in Maui, half the year, and then the other half is in Paris. Rough life, right? But so one of the interesting things is the how immigration works there. If you are not a national, and so if you are someone who doesn't have, if you're not a citizen, you can only be in Paris or France for 90 consecutive days, and then you have to leave for 90 consecutive days before you can return. So even though this individual, he actually owned a flat in Paris that was very, very nice, he's only allowed to be at that property for no more than 90 days consecutively. So what he does is he comes to Paris, he's there for 90 days, he goes back to Hawaii, there for 90 days, and then he kind of comes back. So every 3 months, he's going back and forth. And the only way to navigate around that is by becoming a citizen, and that can be, there can be some challenges with that. I shared with him that I was in mortgage banking, and I was just asking him, what is the process like acquiring this place? Because he's also a property owner in the United States as well. And so he was kind of talking through how the approval process works, how the real estate process works. And out there, they don't have actual real estate agents. They're called something else. But to buy and sell a home out there is like way, way more expensive than it is here. Essentially, you hire a firm, kind of like a real estate firm to handle the transaction, and they go back and they literally research all of the records. And keep in mind that a lot of these buildings were built in the 17 or 1800s, and so they're verifying the legitimacy of the property and the owner and the buyer and seller and the entire transaction for literally hundreds of years. And so what he was saying is that the actual costs a lot of times can be anywhere from 10 to 15% that you have to pay this clearinghouse or this real estate clearinghouse. And then the other thing is the cost of housing. Europe is also going through a little bit of a housing crisis that we're also seeing in a lot of the cities here in the United States. Paris, for example, is one of the most expensive cities in Europe, and I believe in the entire world. And so, this individual was just sharing with me how expensive it was just to buy the property. And then he said that it was supposed to be a 60-day escrow period, and the financing was very, very difficult, and they had to extend it, and it took them like 4 or 5 months, he said, to actually close on this property. And so, typically in the United States, a lot of cities and states, you're looking at 30 to 45 days. In Colorado, 30 days is very customary, but out there, it can be 2 to 5 months to actually close on something. So that was one of the, just kind of like learning that, very, very different than what we have here.
Do you think it's similar as far as the percentage required to put down as your down payment? Do you think that's also kind of in that, 5 to 20% range, or think that might be also different?
Yeah, I got the feeling that they require more or a larger down payment there than what we do here. And I think, for a variety of reasons, I think the cost of housing is so much higher kind of on average out there. And, this individual, this was kind of a quasi second home for him. And I asked him, I was like, is this a property that you're going to be renting out? Do you do Airbnb? He doesn't do anything like that. He was also in the process of renovating it. But I think that's one of the big benefits of the United States is that we do have, if you are a first-time home buyer, we have these reduced down payment programs. We have these minimal down. You can get into an FHA with 3.5% down. There's also down payment assistance. Right now, there's a lot of great affordable housing programs out there where if your income is below the median income for your zip code, you're going to get very favorable financing terms. And I was basing this off of my conversation with him, but it didn't seem like a lot of those same programs that we have here are available. And here, we have so many different banks that you can use. Some of them are government, sponsored, like FHA or VA. Others are portfolio specific to the bank, and then you have the conventional Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. So we have a very diverse lending system here, and it didn't feel like out there it was nearly as diverse or you had as many options.
I remember you also made a comment just about the size of homes over there and just how incredibly different that is from the US. Was that the case in all three of the countries you went to, or was that an observation in one of those more specifically?
Yeah, that was definitely the case in Paris. All four of the places that we stayed in Paris, and we kind of, we stayed at a new place about every 4 days. So we spent, 3 nights at one place and then went to the next place. So we got to experience 3 or 4 different spots in Paris, and they were all very, very tiny. I'm talking, just a couple of hundred square feet for some of them. I mean, it was very, very tiny. And, there we didn't. This is a funny story that I love sharing. The last place that we stayed was probably 200 years old. And so you have to think that when they were building this back in the 17 or 1800s, you know, just elevators didn't exist, and plumbing and electricity, all of that stuff was very, very different. And so the last place that we stayed, we were on the penthouse, which I thought sounded amazing. But then you have to go up this spiral staircase that is about shoulder wide, and you have to go up 5 flights of stairs. And so by the time that you get to the top, you are beyond nauseous from how, dizzy it is from going up these spiral stairs. Well, anyways, we were on the 5th floor, and the apartment directly below us on the 4th floor, they had their door open. And so in this specific apartment, when you opened the door, guess what you walked into when you opened the door?
I hope you don't say the bathroom.
The toilet. Literally, the toilet was on the landing of the front door. And that's not, I mean, I wouldn't say it's normal out there, but it's not uncommon. And so like you literally open the front door and there is the toilet, like literally like within a foot of the front door. And so you'll see things like that that make no sense to us in the United States. Overall, the square footage much smaller. The bathrooms are all much smaller. Showers. The bedrooms also very very small. A lot of the bedrooms, and I'm talking like Central Paris at this point. A lot of the bedrooms are just as wide as the bed, and the dimensions are typically about as wide as the bed, or maybe a little bit bigger. And not a lot of closets, not a lot of closet space. We had to put our like really we couldn't even like hardly open our suitcases. So we had to put our suitcases on the bed and then shove them under the bed because there was nowhere else for them to go. And so it felt very tight at times, but just kind of the everyone lives right there. So you have flats, and the flats a lot of times are 4 to 5 stories tall. Typically that lower level is going to be some type of retail, commercial, some type of business. And then literally all of the citizens of the city live on top of the businesses. So that is what's nice about it, is that although, at least for Americans, it feels a little more cramped, things are much more accessible as far as, grocery stores, convenience stores, delis, pastry shops. It's all kind of like right there. And all of that stuff is on every single block. And that was kind of fun to experience. Just having all of that in the U.S. I live in suburbia Denver, and there's really nothing within walking distance of my neighborhood. So getting to experience that was really fun.
Yeah, imagining not very many garages, and just the people are not nearly as materialistic, I imagine, just not having this excessive amount of just stuff. When you're, living in a
Yeah,
place like that, you don't have anywhere to put that stuff.
that is such a great point. Because you don't like you can't have a lot of stuff there because there's no room. And to your point about the cars, like you don't if you live in a big European city, like you probably don't want to own a vehicle because they don't have parking garages there, and all of the restaurants and the places like there's no parking lots anywhere. And you see taxis and Ubers on the road. If you own a car, you're more than likely going to have to park it on the street, and there's just not hardly any parking, and there's no private parking. And even if you were going to drive somewhere to your friend's house, and then you have to go park, and that's a huge problem. There's like nowhere to park. So that, and then yeah, you don't really see yards. A lot of the flats will have like a courtyard on the inside, and that was fun, where there's a small courtyard for everyone to share, but you don't really have a front yard, or there's no porch or no patio in most cases. You can't let your dog go play in the backyard because no one has backyards. The way that they make up for that, there's a lot of parks, and the parks are kind of there's smaller parks, bigger parks, larger parks, but they're in all of these small little communities. And so that's what everyone does is you take your dog to the park. And one other quick thing, I have never seen so many dogs off leash as in Paris. Like if you have a dog, they must train it out there, but like the dogs in Paris do not walk on leash. Every dog for the most part walks off leash.
It's a little different.
I was thinking about my dogs. I was like, dude, if my dogs were here, like this would be a catastrophe. They would just run us off.
Yeah, you'd be in jail probably too.
Yeah, that's right.
So I'd love to just kind of close out this episode a little bit more in depth on like again, comparing Europe to the USA when it comes to like the median income of individuals over there, just like what people are making, and just some of that side of things. Because I know I've kind of had friends in the past that have either lived over in Europe, or even just had a few friends way back in the day that were doing like study abroad type stuff in the US that I got to be pretty close with, where They were just talking about how they really don't have the same sense of like always wanting more and more and more. And like America, there's never this level of contentment for a lot of people. And I'll admit that I fall into that category too, where you always want to, be making more money and more this, more that. And it just
Yeah.
seems like Europe has a much more kind of grounded approach to life when it comes to work, play, what they consider adequate amount of money to live on, all that kind of stuff. So I know you had some statistics and some really cool info that I thought was valuable when I was just reviewing it earlier.
Yeah, and that's such a great point because how they live their life out there, I would say it's much more leisure focused. I feel like in the United States, I do feel like this is changing a little bit where we're not putting as much of an emphasis on work and working long hours, but over there, it's still much more balanced. And just being someone who is, again, very interested in real estate, business, I had a lot of conversation with individuals out there, and one thing that is very, very difficult is just to be a business owner in France and a lot of these other European countries. A lot of them are part of the European Union, but then the country will still have its own, rules and requirements, the do's and don'ts as far as owning a business. And that can vary widely from one country to the next. One thing that's really, really interesting is when you look at the median income in Europe compared to the United States, it's about 44,000 per household in Europe, whereas right now in the United States, the median income is around 74,500. So a very, very big discrepancy in median income. And keep in mind that 15 years ago, the median income for Europe compared to the US was, almost identical. And so over the last 15 years, things in the US, our income has continued to increase. But then not only that, the tax system out there is very, very different. The tax rate in a lot of these countries is much, much higher than what it is in the United States. And so on average, they're making less money, and then their tax rate can be significantly higher. But they also have government programs that I think a lot of people would consider in some cases superior to ours, kind of their healthcare system and just kind of some of their other government providing systems. A lot of that is included in kind of in the tax rate. So I found that very, very interesting. And I didn't go to England, but this is something that really fascinated me. I was reading an article while I was there, and the United Kingdom left the European Union a couple years ago, as you probably know. And part of that was, there are a lot of reasons, but part of that they wanted to be able to develop more direct relations with the United States themselves, instead of through the European Union. So that was one of the big, big reasons why they did that. But to kind of put things in perspective, England as a country, if they were in the United States, their GDP they would be the first state in GDP. So right now, the state of Mississippi has the lowest GDP in the United States. And if England, the entire country, were a state in the US, they would be less than Mississippi. So that kind of just gives
Wow.
you an idea of the economic output. And like to me, I just found that so shocking. And that's also, reflective in income for your average adult, but then also net worth as well. This was a statistic that I looked up. The average net worth of an adult in Europe is around 84,000 compared to around 190,000 for an adult in the USA. And of course, there's a lot of you know contributing factors to that. Is the person a homeowner or not in both Europe and the United States? But kind of on average, they make less over there. They have a lower net worth, and I would say they their focus and their goals are very, very different than what we have here. So being an American, one of my biggest takeaways was I'm very glad that I had the opportunity to go visit. And in my mind, like Europe is a place that you want to go visit, but I don't know if it's someone that you want to live permanently. Maybe if you might want to retire there, you might want to have a second home there, spend some time there every year. But we do have a lot of incredible advantages of being Americans, and that was another big takeaway of mine is just how thankful and how much gratitude I have for being an American and all the opportunities and privileges that we have here. Because even in a Europe, which is considered part of the West. They live very differently than we do.
Just hearing you talk about some of that net worth stuff was just had my brain going in a little different direction. Just wondering, what percentage of people in France, for example, are homeowners versus renters, and you hear a lot of statistics in the U.S. when they compare the difference in net worth of a renter versus a homeowner, and
Mhm.
it's staggering. I think it's like $8,000 net worth for a renter, and a
Yeah.
homeowners over 100,000. Pretty crazy difference between those two. I just wonder if the fact that the median, or excuse me, the fact that the average net worth is much lower in Europe, I wonder if that means that there's just a lot less home ownership also.
I'm guessing you're probably right, because a lot of these big cities, with the income being as low as it is, well, that's not reflected in housing. Housing is still very expensive, and in Paris, for example, I mean that's as expensive or more expensive than any other United States city that we have. It's extremely, extremely expensive. So if your average income, is 40 or 50,000, a lot of times you're not going to be able to afford housing, and you kind of get stuck in this cycle where you're forced to rent and you don't have those same opportunities and advantages. And yeah, it's I think there are a lot more renters out there, and I think in the US, cities like Denver, for example, that's why people are a little more reluctant right now at times to kind of go buy something, just because the cost of homeownership can be a little bit more than the cost of renting. But when you look at the long-term advantages of owning, uh, those are all still there. It's just getting in and penetrating that market for the first time, which is so difficult. And but I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a much smaller percentage of folks or homeowners out there compared to the U.S.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to also find out of the ownership over there. Is it, people that are just owning one family home that maybe they got passed down from generation to generation, or if it's, bigger corporations that are, like BlackRock type scenarios here in the United States, where there's corporations that own just a ton of real estate and they're renting those back to, French people or wherever European country we're talking about. Yeah, just interesting how different some of that stuff just
Yeah,
got me thinking.
generational wealth is something that we like to talk about a lot in the United States, but generational wealth in Europe, I mean, you're talking could be hundreds of years, going back in the 15 or 1600s. And, I didn't get a chance to talk about this earlier, but, I went to the Louvre Museum, for example. And this is just another very interesting stat, as far as like an economic stat. So if you're not familiar, the Louvre Museum is in Paris, and that was the former royal residence of the French monarchy, into the 16, 17, 1800s. That's also where Napoleon had his residence as well. And it's this massive, massive castle. The Louvre Museum is formerly the Louvre Palace, which is the largest palace in the world. Now, this palace also holds some of the most incredible art in the world now. So it used to be a palace and now it's a museum, and the entire museum is full of art. That's where the Mona Lisa is housed at. And so I was just, looking this up, like how much, what is the value of the Louvre Palace by itself without the art? And it's valued at several billion dollars. I think it was like 2 or 3 billion dollars. And then I did a search for, what is the value of this palace with the art? And that was estimated around like 9 or 10 billion. And so this entire immaculate palace, and I think it has something like 300,000 square feet, and it's probably even more than that because it is just so overwhelmingly big. And then it has, some of the most famous art in the world, and it's still only valued at like 9 or 10 billion. And then you think of some of these billionaires, and I'm just thinking to myself, someone like an Elon Musk or a Jeff Bezos, they could go and buy this thing like 20 times over with all of the art in there. And obviously, a lot of the art in there is priceless and you can't really put a price tag on it. But just like, and that was kind of like my aha moment. Like, what does $1 billion really look like? And I was walking around this palace and it was like, this palace is like $1 billion, 2 billion, And so that was kind of an eye-opening moment for me.
That's crazy. Yeah, I remember when I was putting some content together for an email newsletter I put out a couple months ago, looking up just what would the most valuable piece of real estate in the world be, and one of the properties that popped up was Buckingham Palace, and it didn't have a dollar amount exactly, obviously, but I think it was like 3 to 4 billion, something like that. Which is funny, going back to your comment about, if they were to be in the US, it would be like the 51st state, thinking through the, cost of that home or that property versus everything else. Crazy.
Yeah, pretty remarkable. It was really fun to learn about the culture, the economic system, and just everything. Just being a business owner, how a lot of the people live out there. So I was very, very thankful that we got the opportunity to go, and excited to share that.
What would be, kind of closing us out, what would be the next European trip to go on as far as locations and what you learned from this first trip? What really is on your guys' radar now for the next trip?
Yeah, what's nice about Paris is that the flights from Denver to Paris were very, very cheap. So to fly into Paris was, much cheaper than to fly into Rome directly or into Berlin or some of these other European cities. So I think moving forward, like we'll always fly into Paris. And then these intra-Europe flights, like going from Paris to Berlin or Paris to Rome, I mean, it was like $40 a person. So incredibly cheap. And that's the equivalent of going from Denver to LA or Denver to Tucson. It was an hour and a half to 2 hours. The intra-Europe flights, though, were just so cheap. So that was really, really incredible. I loved Berlin. I was moderately excited to go to Berlin, but, I loved the city of Berlin. It was very, very clean, very modern. Essentially, they had to rebuild the entire city after World War II. The infrastructure, the roads, the public transportation, extremely clean. And I was really, really amazed with Berlin. So I'd love to go to other parts of Germany. And I would love to also make it to Spain at some point. Get out to Barcelona or Madrid.
Yeah, Spain's on top of my list.
Yeah, I think so. And like the south of France, the Amalfi Coast in Italy. So still lots of great places to go, and that's what's so fun about Europe is that in the United States, you might drive to Kansas or fly to Kansas City or Phoenix, Arizona, but in Europe, it's like you have all these different destinations right at your fingertips, and it's an hour or 2 hours from wherever you're at. And when we were in Berlin, for example, we did a walking food tour. And there was a couple that was from Sweden that was just out for a holiday weekend. And, we were chatting with them and, they was like an hour flight from where they were at. And so it's just much, much closer in Europe compared to the US. Essentially we're an entire continent and everything is much more condensed over there. But yeah, I would say other parts of Germany, Spain, and it'd be fun to make it to England at some point as well.
Yeah, you're inspiring me to get over there. That's the one continent I haven't been to yet, so definitely on my bucket list here in the next year or two.
That's the only place you haven't been to. You're so well traveled, and it's kind of shocking to think that you haven't made it to Europe with all the places that you've been.
Well, it's on the list. So cool, guys. Well, hope you guys were all as happy as I was to have Ben back on the show. Excited to have him back now on the weekly basis, and got a lot of good interviews and just other really informative but also entertaining content on the horizon. So excited to share all that with you guys. Ben, I'll let you close us out this week, though. You have any last words before we sign off today?
Yeah, I'm very excited to be back, and a great job staying up with things and some of the other guests. I learned a lot from the last 3 or 4 weeks with some of the different real estate experts that you had on. So excited to be back, but looking forward to having some more guests on in the future.
Yep, absolutely. All right, guys. Hope you have a great rest of your week. And as always, thank you so much for listening or watching the Pursuit of Progress podcast.
The Pursuit of Progress.
Catch you guys next week.